The British monarchy just did something unprecedented. King Charles has broken decades of royal silence, and what he said has sent shockwaves through Westminster, Downing Street, and every corner of Britain. This isn't about protocol or tradition anymore. This is about power, control, and a constitutional crisis that nobody saw coming. Prime Minister Keir Starmer thought he had the upper hand, but the King just changed the entire game. What happened behind those palace walls has left the government scrambling, the media in chaos, and millions of Britons asking one question: who really runs this country? The gloves are off, the battle lines are drawn, and what comes next could reshape Britain forever. This is the story they don't want you to know. Picture this. It's a cold morning in London, and inside Buckingham Palace, something extraordinary is happening. King Charles, the man who has spent his entire life preparing for the throne, the monarch who was supposed to stay silent on political matters, has just done the unthinkable. He's fired back at Prime Minister Keir Starmer, and the implications are absolutely massive. Now, before we dive into what exactly was said and why this matters so much, you need to understand something crucial. The British monarchy operates under an unwritten rule that has existed for over a century. The sovereign reigns but does not rule. The king has the crown, the title, the palaces, but the real power, that belongs to Parliament, to the Prime Minister, to the elected government. That's how it's supposed to work. That's the delicate balance that keeps the United Kingdom functioning as a constitutional monarchy. But something has changed. Something has pushed King Charles to break that sacred silence. And when you understand what that something is, you'll realise why this moment is so significant. Let's rewind a few weeks. Prime Minister Keir Starmer's Labour government has been making waves with a series of controversial policy announcements. We're talking about radical reforms that touch everything from taxation to housing, from environmental regulations to Britain's relationship with Europe. Now, policy debates are normal. Governments propose, opposition opposes, Parliament debates, and eventually decisions get made. That's democracy in action. But here's where things get interesting. Several of these policies directly impact the Crown Estate, the royal finances, and even the constitutional role of the monarchy itself. Starmer's government has been pushing for what they call modernisation. They want transparency in royal finances. They want to reduce the sovereign grant. They want to open up discussions about the future role of the monarchy in 21st century Britain. On the surface, these might seem like reasonable proposals. After all, shouldn't public institutions be transparent? Shouldn't taxpayers know where their money goes? But dig deeper and you'll see something else entirely. This isn't just about transparency or modernisation. This is about power. This is about a Labour government testing the boundaries, seeing how far they can push, how much they can reshape Britain's ancient institutions while they have the majority in Parliament. King Charles saw it coming. His advisors saw it coming, but the constitutional playbook says the monarch stays silent. The king reads the government speeches at the state opening of Parliament. He signs the laws that Parliament passes. He meets with the Prime Minister every week for private audiences, but he doesn't fight back. He doesn't publicly disagree. He doesn't get involved in politics, except this time he did. Sources from inside the palace, people close to the king, began leaking information to trusted journalists. The message was clear and unmistakable. His Majesty is deeply concerned about the direction of government policy. The king believes that certain proposals cross constitutional red lines. And most explosive of all, King Charles has made it known that he will not simply rubber stamp legislation that undermines the monarchy's independence and the balance of power that has kept Britain stable for generations. This wasn't a formal speech. This wasn't an official statement. But in the coded world of British constitutional politics, this was a nuclear bomb. The king had fired back, and everyone who understands how this game is played knew exactly what it meant. The reaction was instant and divided. Monarchists, traditionalists, and conservatives erupted in support. Finally, they said someone is standing up to government overreach. Finally, the institution that has guided Britain through wars, depressions, and countless political storms is defending itself. They pointed out that King Charles has every right to express concerns, that his role as head of state includes being a guardian of constitutional stability, and that if Parliament oversteps, the sovereign must respond. But on the other side, Republicans, progressives and Labour supporters were outraged. Who does he think he is, they asked. Britain is a democracy, not an absolute monarchy. The king doesn't get to veto the will of Parliament. He doesn't get to interfere in political decisions. If he disagrees with government policy, then maybe it's time to have a serious conversation about whether Britain needs a monarchy at all. Social media exploded. Television debates became heated. Newspaper front pages screamed conflicting headlines. Britain was dividing along lines that hadn't been this clear in decades. And right in the middle of it all were two men, King Charles and Keir Starmer, locked in a constitutional showdown that neither could afford to lose. Now, let's talk about Keir Starmer for a moment, because understanding him is crucial to understanding this entire situation. Starmer is not your typical Labour leader. He's not a firebrand revolutionary. He's not Jeremy Corbyn calling for the abolition of the House of Lords and the monarchy. No, Starmer is a lawyer, a former director of public prosecutions, a man who built his career on working within the system, understanding the law and playing the long game. When he became Labour leader, he moved the party back toward the centre. He made Labour electable again. He won the general election by promising competence, stability and sensible reform. But here's the thing about Starmer. Underneath that calm, lawyerly exterior is a man with a plan. He believes Britain's institutions need updating. He believes the monarchy, the House of Lords, the way Britain is governed, all of it is outdated and needs reforming for the modern age. And now that he has power, he's not going to waste it. He's pushing his agenda hard and fast, and if that means tension with the palace, so be it. Starmer calculated that King Charles wouldn't fight back, that the tradition of royal silence was too strong to break. He was wrong. The moment King Charles pushed back, everything changed for Starmer's government. The Prime Minister found himself in a position no modern British leader expected to face. He was suddenly fighting a battle on two fronts, defending his policies in Parliament while simultaneously trying to manage a constitutional crisis with the monarchy. The political calculations that seemed so straightforward just weeks ago now looked incredibly complicated. Starmer's team went into damage control mode immediately. They started briefing journalists, carefully choosing their words, trying to frame this entire situation as a misunderstanding. The government respects the monarchy, they said. The Prime Minister has enormous admiration for His Majesty. These reforms are simply about ensuring accountability and transparency in all public institutions, including the Crown. Nobody is attacking the monarchy. Nobody wants a constitutional crisis. But those carefully crafted statements couldn't hide the underlying reality. The government had pushed too far, too fast, and now they were facing resistance from an institution they thought would never resist. Behind closed doors, the conversations were far more heated than the public statement suggested. Cabinet ministers were divided. Some believed they should back down, compromise, find a middle ground that would satisfy the king and avoid this turning into a full-blown crisis. Others argued the opposite. They said if the government backs down now, it shows weakness. It shows that elected officials can be bullied by unelected institutions. It sets a dangerous precedent that would haunt Labour for years to come. Starmer himself was caught in an impossible position. As a lawyer, he understood the constitutional complexities better than most politicians. He knew the monarchy's role, the unwritten conventions, the delicate balance that had evolved over centuries. But as Prime Minister, as leader of a Labour government with a mandate for change, he couldn't simply surrender whenever the palace expressed displeasure. That would make him look weak. It would undermine his authority. It would embolden every other institution and interest group that opposed his reforms. So Starmer made a decision. He would stand firm on the substance of his policies, but open channels for negotiation on the details. He requested a private audience with King Charles, something that normally happens weekly anyway, but this time everyone knew it would be different. This wouldn't be the usual polite conversation about government business. This would be a confrontation, a negotiation, two powerful men trying to find a way out of a crisis that neither wanted, but both had helped create. The meeting was scheduled for a Tuesday afternoon at Buckingham Palace. No photographers, no official statements, just the King and the Prime Minister behind closed doors, with the future of Britain's constitutional arrangement hanging in the balance. What happened in that room? We may never know fully. The conversations between the monarch and Prime Minister are supposed to remain confidential. That's part of the constitutional tradition. The King must be able to speak freely, to warn, to advise, without fear that his words will become public political ammunition. But leaks happen, sources talk, and gradually a picture emerged of what transpired during that crucial meeting. King Charles was reportedly firm but measured. He made clear that his concerns were not personal, not about protecting his own position or privileges. Instead, he argued that some of Starmer's proposed reforms would fundamentally alter the constitutional balance in ways that could destabilise the entire system. He pointed to historical precedents, to moments when political leaders thought they could reshape ancient institutions quickly, only to discover unintended consequences that took decades to fix. The King emphasised that he was not opposing reform itself. He acknowledged that institutions must evolve with the times. But evolution, he argued, must be careful, gradual and respectful of the deep roots that give these institutions their strength and legitimacy. Rushing through changes to score political points or satisfy party activists would be reckless and dangerous. Starmer listened, as any Prime Minister must when the King speaks, but he also pushed back with his own arguments. He reminded His Majesty that he was elected with a clear mandate. Millions of Britons voted for change, for modernisation, for a government that would shake up the old establishment and make Britain work better for ordinary people. Those voters didn't care about constitutional niceties or centuries-old traditions. They cared about their jobs, their housing, their futures. And if the monarchy became an obstacle to delivering what those voters demanded, then the monarchy itself would face questions about its relevance and legitimacy. It was a subtle threat wrapped in respectful language, but a threat nonetheless. Starmer was essentially saying that if the King blocked popular reforms, public opinion might turn against the Crown. And in a democracy, public opinion ultimately matters more than royal prerogative. The two men talked for over an hour, far longer than the usual weekly audience. When Starmer finally left the palace, his face was carefully neutral. No smiles, no frowns, just the practiced expression of a politician who knows cameras are watching. But people who know how to read these situations understood. Nothing had been resolved. The crisis was not over. If anything, it had just entered a new and potentially more dangerous phase. Outside the palace walls, Britain was watching and waiting. The newspapers had turned this into the biggest story in the country. Every day brought new analysis, new commentary, new speculation about what would happen next. Constitutional experts were wheeled out on television programmes to explain the arcane rules and precedents that governed this situation. Some argued the King was within his rights, that the sovereign has not just ceremonial powers but real constitutional responsibilities, including the duty to warn the government when it goes too far. Others insisted this was dangerous territory, that any hint of royal interference in democratic politics was unacceptable in the 21st century. Public opinion polls showed the country was split almost exactly down the middle. Half of Britons supported King Charles and believed he was right to express concerns about government overreach. The other half supported Starmer and believed elected officials should not be constrained by unelected monarchs. The division wasn't just political. It cut across age groups, regions and social classes, revealing deep disagreements about what kind of country Britain should be. The standoff between King Charles and Keir Starmer was now dominating every aspect of British political life, and the pressure was building to unsustainable levels. Parliament became a battlefield where every debate, every question, every speech somehow circled back to this fundamental crisis. Opposition parties sensed blood in the water and they were circling. The Conservatives, still reeling from their election defeat, suddenly found new energy and purpose. They accused Starmer of picking an unnecessary fight with the monarchy, of pursuing ideological reforms that divided the nation instead of focusing on the real problems ordinary people faced. They demanded the Prime Minister back down, show respect for Britain's institutions and stop playing political games with the Constitution. The Scottish National Party saw an opportunity too, arguing that this whole mess proved the British constitutional system was broken beyond repair and that Scotland needed independence to escape the chaos. Even some Labour backbenchers were getting nervous. These were MPs from traditional constituencies, places where the monarchy was still respected and valued. They started receiving angry letters from constituents, people who had voted Labour for economic reasons but were deeply uncomfortable with anything that looked like an attack on the king. The media frenzy intensified with each passing day. Tabloids ran front pages with dramatic headlines painting this as an epic clash between tradition and radicalism, stability and chaos. The Crown and the people. Broadsheet newspapers published lengthy opinion pieces from constitutional historians, legal scholars, and political commentators, each offering their interpretation of what was happening and what it meant for Britain's future. Television news programmes brought together panels of experts who argued passionately about precedents, conventions, and the unwritten rules that govern the relationship between monarch and government. Social media became even more polarised, with hashtags supporting both sides trending simultaneously. Videos went viral showing people debating this issue in pubs, at dinner tables, on street corners. Britain was having a conversation about fundamental questions that many thought had been settled generations ago. What is the role of the monarchy in a modern democracy? Where does the power of elected government end and the authority of constitutional institutions begin? Who really runs Britain? And who should run Britain? These weren't abstract academic questions anymore. They were urgent, immediate, and deeply personal for millions of people. Behind the scenes, desperate attempts at mediation were underway. Senior figures from both the royal household and the government were working frantically to find some kind of compromise that would allow both sides to step back from the brink without losing face. The Archbishop of Canterbury, as spiritual leader of the Church of England and a figure with connections to both the Crown and Parliament, tried to facilitate dialogue. Former Prime Ministers from both parties were consulted. Their advice sought on how previous generations had navigated similar tensions. Constitutional lawyers drafted possible compromise language that might satisfy the King's concerns while allowing the government to proceed with modified versions of their reforms. But every proposed solution ran into the same fundamental problem. King Charles believed certain principles were non-negotiable. He would not allow reforms that he believed fundamentally undermined the monarchy's independence and constitutional role, regardless of political pressure. And Starmer believed he had a democratic mandate that could not be vetoed by unelected institutions, regardless of tradition or convention. Two immovable forces had collided and something had to give. The situation reached a critical moment when Starmer's government announced they would proceed with introducing their reform legislation to Parliament, despite the ongoing dispute with the palace. The bill was formally titled the Constitutional Modernisation Act, and it contained all the controversial measures that had sparked this crisis: reduced funding for the royal household, new transparency requirements, parliamentary oversight of Crown estate decisions, and provisions that would fundamentally alter the balance of power between monarchy and government. When news of the bill's introduction broke, the palace responded with unprecedented speed. Within hours, a statement was released on official royal letterhead. It was carefully worded, as everything from the palace must be, but the message was unmistakable. His Majesty had noted the government's decision to proceed with the legislation. The King remained deeply concerned about several provisions within the bill. His Majesty believed these measures raised serious constitutional questions that required careful consideration and consultation. The statement stopped short of saying the King would refuse royal assent if the bill passed Parliament, but that threat hung in the air, unspoken but understood by everyone paying attention.